Hi, everybody, and welcome to Mark Overanalyses Film. Today I'll be overanalyzing 1995's Seven. Seven was written by Andrew Kevin Walker and directed by David Fincher. This is actually the second film to feature on this podcast by David Fincher, which seems a bit soon, but it's the seventh episode, and I haven't really done a straight up thriller film yet, and it's a really good film, so here we are. Now, I was interested in doing a thriller anyways, and something relatively modern, and the question came to me as to why I put Seven up there, basically with Silence of the Lambs as the two really standout thrillers that come to mind. They are so purely thriller-y, somehow, to my mind. Very much in their genre, but also with some kind of extra prestige than most thrillers. So I'm wondering pretty simply, what makes Seven so good? What makes it stand out? What makes it, different from The Girl on the Train or Murder by Numbers or Along Came a Spider or Sliver or something? So I'll be thinking about that as I go along here. So with that in mind, I'll first look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. Then I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. So without further ado, let's get into the altogether inappropriately 5 questions about the protagonist. Question 1. Whose story is it? Or who is the protagonist? Now, this is immediately a very interesting question to me. Is this Morgan Freeman's movie, or is it Brad Pitt's movie? We start with Freeman's Somerset and we end with him, but Pitt's Mills turns up within 2 minutes of the film starting, and I think it's also fair to say that he takes the most dramatic action of the climax. So when you think of Seven, what do you see? Who do you see? Is it Somerset listing the sins? Or is it Mills' pained face at the climax? Or is it something else? Would that make it their movie? Does it make it their movie? Well, for reasons I'd like to discuss in much greater detail later, to my mind, this is the story of Detective William Somerset, an old-hand police detective worn down by his job, by the city, and by life in general. Question 2. What is his life dream? So, life dream here refers to what it is that the protagonist wants or is aiming to do when the film begins, and the story has yet to properly start. So, what is it that Somerset is planning when we first meet him? Well, he's retiring and moving to the countryside, far away from this city. Another harsher, more commonly used in Seven way of phrasing it is that he's quitting or giving up. Question 3. What is his want? Want here refers to what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film, from the moment they start their new adventure or journey until, generally, the point where they seem most defeated. At least, it's the point where they seem most defeated when there's a happy ending. Seven, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Like most films, though, the want in Seven is a SMART goal. That is to say, it is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So Seven is a straight genre kind of film, so this is pretty straightforward. Somerset wants to stop the serial killer, even if at first he's actually trying to, not get involved. Act 2 begins the moment that Somerset learns that 2 murders are related and confirms that this is the work of a serial killer. It ends when John Doe turns himself in. Question 4. What is his need? The protagonist's need in this instance is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story. Again, I'm going to talk more about this later, but I believe Somerset's need is to not give up, to not give in to despair, to, hope in some way. Question 5. Does he get what he wants and or what he needs? The want here is pretty clear. At the end of Act 2, John Doe surprisingly turns himself in, meaning Somerset appears to have gotten what he wants. The need is much more up for debate and for good reason. So again, I'll pick up on this later as we discuss who the protagonist is. Okay, now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, at least to some extent, let's have a look at Seven's sequences. Again, disappointingly, there are not actually 7 of them. Honestly, David Fincher, are you even trying? There is normally, but not always, 8 sequences or, you could say stages in a film either. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. Now, it's debatable, but I'd say 7 probably has 10 sequences, but it certainly fits our 8, stages paradigm. So, Act 1 contains the first 2 sequences, the first of which is normally some version of Life as It Is, and 7 has a great introductory sequence, so I'd like to spend a little extra time on it. The first thing we see is Somerset getting ready in the morning. It's very brief and very simple, but it says a lot. He brings his coffee mug to the sink, pours out the rest of the pot, not leaving it for the day, and fixes his shirt and tie while a chessboard sits in the foreground. He picks off a piece of dust on his suit jacket before putting it on. He takes care to the fine details. And then he goes outside, and the world is a shithole. There's been a crime of passion where a wife has murdered her husband with a shotgun. Somerset asks another police officer there if a child saw one of their parents murder their other parent with a shotgun, which would, be less than ideal. But the other cop not only doesn't answer the question, he abuses Somerset for having the temerity to even ask the question. The message is clear. Nobody cares about anybody else. Now, this is really important thematically, and it's great that the film tells us this so quickly, because something else is going to happen as soon as Mills rocks up. This other cop on the scene might have checked out, but Mills is ambitious. Unfortunately, Mills is also obnoxious, pushy, quick to temper, and not too bright. Why, Mills, why would you pick a fight with Somerset immediately? It's so needless. So, Somerset is weary and alone, Mills is impatient and angry. At that, we have a Fincher specialty, a credit sequence. And first we saw Somerset get ready, now we see John Doe get ready. I think using the credits this way is really clever. It introduces the killer without him really being directly part of the story's fabric yet. It helps considering we won't really meet him for another 88 minutes. Once the credits are over, it's then Mills's turn to get ready. Note his ties are all pre-tied and left on a hanger. We saw Somerset fix his tie. This is all very small, very fast. I certainly didn't clock it on first viewing. But more importantly, Mills is not alone. When he wakes up, he's not only in bed with a woman, but she's draped on top of him. Mills is young, he's messy, he's in love. Okay, now that all of our main players have prepared, the story gets going. The detectives arrive at the first big crime scene. There's probably a few things you could term as the inciting incident, or the event without which our story would not happen in 7, but I'm going to say it's the call to investigate this murder. And there's a lot of character stuff happening here. Mills won't shut up and focus. Somerset isn't exactly that interested in teaching him to be better, which is an example of his jadedness. But one thing this scene is a classic example of, to my mind, is how to button a scene. Now, to button a scene is like buttoning an item of clothing up. It's the moment the scene feels tied up somehow and we move on. As the detectives walk into this crime scene, Mills gets into a needless argument with a cop about checking if the man is indeed dead. Once they get inside, there's really not much doubting it. Now, this would be fine and well. It soon becomes apparent that a bit of patience would have told Mills everything he needed to know, and he wouldn't have needed to piss anybody off to do it. But then at the end of the scene, after we've had all the bizarre evidence and the tension between these two detectives, a forensics doctor arrives. He lifts the head of the corpse, a gross out moment, and declares that the corpse is dead, and Somerset thanks him. This is buttoning the scene, or tying it up if you prefer. Mills's picking a fight over not checking the corpse is called back to and shown to be pointless. This shows that Somerset is the wise old hand and Mills has a lot to learn. The start of the scene has been paid off. Then, after a brief trip to the morgue, 14 minutes in, we end a fantastic first sequence and we enter our second sequence with our first real sequence tension. Somerset asks the police captain to be reassigned. The captain refuses, but then reassigns Mills. Now, we know these two are our two main characters, so they can't be separated like this. So we wonder some version of the question, will Somerset and Mills start working together again? Mills is sent to investigate another mysterious and complex murder, this time of a high-profile lawyer. It's important that it's high-profile because Mills is ambitious, but also green, and this really ramps up the pressure on him. But then we rejoin Somerset, and I love the next scene for the simple but effective filmmaking involved. Somerset is typing. He's disengaged as the police chief comes in to talk to him. And this gives us our scene tension. The chief is trying to get Somerset interested in the other case, to get him interested in general. And when he tells him that greed was written on the floor, Somerset leans back, considers it, then asks the guy scraping his name off the door to please stop. But then, almost seeming to catch himself getting interested, Somerset leans forward back into his typewriter again and returns to his typing. The chief keeps probing, telling him he can't leave really, and they debate whether things have really gotten worse or if Somerset has just given up. And then our scene tension is resolved when the chief reveals that the murder victim was fed some pieces of plastic. Somerset's interest is piqued, and he leans back now and this time turns away from his typewriter, the symbol in this scene of his disengagement.
The coroner sent this down for you. Found him in Fat Boy's stomach. Mixed in with food. Looks like plastic, little pieces of plastic.
Set him on the desk, please.
They were fed to him.
Somerset, despite himself, is in. And this subtle, physical, consistent visual reference that plays out throughout this scene is what tells us this. Now that is filmmaking. God, I love it. We cut to the crime scene where Somerset quickly figures out that the plastic comes from the floor in front of the fridge. He discovers the message gluttony written in grease behind the fridge, and we're off. These crimes are connected, and they're based on the 7 deadly sins. To paraphrase Detective David Mills, ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a plot. And so we end Act 1 and begin Act 2 with one of the most famous scenes from the film, where Somerset outlines the 7 deadly sins. I often talk about how Act 2 begins with a what's the plan scene, which tells us what we can expect over the next hour or so. Well, here Somerset spells it out. You can expect 5 more of these. I also want to point out here just how frickin' watchable Morgan Freeman is. This is a short scene where he's explaining what the sins are and then literally walking away from the investigation. And all I can think of is, that man is a movie star. He is so compelling throughout.
Gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, pride, lust, and envy. 7.
Hold on. That's not even my desk.
You can expect 5 more of these.
Now wait a minute.
I can't get involved in this.
So, will he and Mills start working together again? No. We have a new tension. Something like, will Somerset be able to stay away from the serial killer case? And this is what defines our first sequence of Act 2, Sequence 3, or the first attempts to solve the problem. You'll notice here that like so many Sequence 3s in film, it is defined by the protagonist refusing and then eventually accepting the call to go on this journey. It's so weird to me how often and how clearly that idea defines these 10 to 15 minutes in a film over and over again. Anyways, Somerset watches the world wearily and decides to research the 7 deadly sins in the library. Mills, well, he's trying. But these two are going to be brought back together by the only genuine source of hope in this entire film, Mills's wife, Tracy. These two cops aren't getting on because they're kind of idiots, so Tracy has to bridge the gap by inviting Somerset to dinner and doing complicated, wussy, girly things like learning his first name. Somerset is a cop. I don't know who this William guy is. But Mills does begin to chill out a bit here, playing with his dogs and then importantly allowing himself to be shown foolish by revealing his mistake in buying this apartment. Finally then, the macho ice is broken and these two can actually start working together. They pore over Mills's crime scene, really together now, and when Somerset discovers the clue hidden in the picture, we know that he is back in. Now this means we have come to the end of our sequence 3, and this is generally where the protagonist makes their first unconscious move towards their need, often by accepting the call. Somerset has met an actual nice person in Tracy, has reached an understanding with Mills, and is investigating the case. Despite himself, he wants to help. Despite himself, he hasn't given up. Now we move into sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem, and we have a new tension. Now there's actually probably 2 tensions here, as the detectives first have to figure out what the clue means. Once they do, it gives way to a larger, more dramatic question of, will the fingerprint match lead to the killer? But I want to note, before one gives way to the other here, the 2 detectives again become closer. Exhausted and waiting in hope, Somerset, coming closer to his need, tells Mills that he wishes he still thought like he did. But Mills kind of called him out here on his purported jadedness. Mills knows that Somerset got excited by the clue, the idea that they would catch this guy, that they would do some good. We then cut to something of a visual gag with both men asleep and Mills collapsed into Somerset, mouth agape. But this isn't just a quick visual gag, though it works on that level. It's also a sign that the 2 men have become closer. In the film, it feels like longer, but it's actually only been a few hours since Mills was not too pleased about Somerset coming to his apartment for dinner. Now, there's a few things that I'd like to point out about what happens next. We're approaching the midpoint, and something that often happens right before or at the midpoint is that there's a sudden shot of adrenaline. We're a long way from the start and a long way from the end, so we need a bit of juice to keep us going. So the men don't wake up, they are woken up. Because things are happening now. There's more characters, a sense of urgency, a sense of chase. Also, there's a visual hint that they're not going to get their man, because in the car, Somerset is moving from right to left on our screen. When things are going the way they're meant to, protagonists normally move from left to right. It's just one of those things. And it's worth pointing out here and remembering, just in case another car ride happens to come up later on. Also, I have to say, I think this car scene is probably the weakest in the film. They needed to show that these men are not actually used to killing, so it would be a big deal if, say, one of them shot someone later. But Mills not being able to remember the dead cop's name just feels a bit forced or on the nose to my mind. It's the only thing that really does in the whole film, which is why it stands out. Anyways, they get there and the SWAT team takes the door and they discover a desiccated corpse that is somehow not actually a corpse yet. It's pretty shocking stuff, even by the standards Seven has set. And importantly, it shakes Mills. So outside, he's feeding off his emotions, getting into a needless fight with someone they think is a photographer. Now, this scene begins with them saying that the killer is playing games with them, and here we will learn that he really is, and that Mills really lost this game because of his temper, which is going to sound awfully familiar very soon. Now, this means that Mills is not really learning what he needs to from Somerset, but Somerset might just be learning something himself. And this brings us, to my mind, to the midpoint of the film, or the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. At home that night, Somerset receives a call from Tracy, and they meet the following morning. Tracy reveals that she's pregnant with the clear suggestion that she's unsure whether or not to keep the baby because she's so unhappy and she hates this city so much. Somerset tells her a story about how he had the possibility of being a father once, but that he suddenly became afraid as soon as he found out and convinced his partner not to keep it. Then he says something I always find really interesting.
I want to have children.
I can tell you now that I know me. I'm positive that I made the right decision. But there's not a day that passes that I don't wish that I had made a different choice.
Now, that sounds like he regrets making the correct choice, which is an unusual position to be in. But to my mind, this is Somerset and his need all over. He's drawn towards hope, but bathed in despair. I get the impression that Somerset knows he's a crank. He says himself that people tend to find him disagreeable. But he would love to be the kind of person that could make people happy. And that's why it's so impactful, I think, when he tells Tracy that if she decides to keep the baby, she should spoil it every chance she gets. So at that, we enter sequence 5, which is our honeymoon sequence. This is where the protagonist, beginning to act in accordance with his need, has things start to go generally kind of well for him. And so Somerset here gets an idea, and he's genuinely energized. And so we wonder, will Somerset's hunch pay off? And you'll notice here that while Mills might be moody and complaining, he is actually doing what Somerset is asking him to do. So things are going well. And after some legally dubious detective work, they do have a lead, something to chase, literally. At John Doe's door, they are shot at and Mills takes off in pursuit. Now this is really important to my mind for a couple of reasons. We'll meet John Doe later, but we don't see much of him for most of the film. But he is, of course, our main antagonist. He's the bad guy. Somerset and Mills are our good guys. They're a team. Somerset is smart. Mills is young and athletic. Doe is, a challenge for Somerset mentally and psychologically throughout. But here, he also outmatches Mills's physicality. So it really tells us that the evil is a match for the good. Also, it's worth noting that not only does Doe get away, but Somerset can't keep up with these two as he's, getting old. We sense that things are no longer going that well, and this is confirmed when Somerset and Mills are no longer on the same page. Mills, giving in to his impulsiveness and against all good practice, kicks John Doe's door down. And so we end our honeymoon sequence and we enter sequence 6, the bridge from the honeymoon period to the low point. Now, again, there's actually more than one sequence in this section, I think, which in a film as dark as Seven makes sense. Things are going to get darker and then darker again. And so the first of these sequences could be defined by the question, will Somerset and Mills find a clue in John Doe's apartment? And there's certainly a lot of troubling stuff here, but they are struggling to sort the murderous wheat from the merely disturbing chaff. And you'll notice that Mills is driving this sequence. While he's all action, Somerset is coming face to face with the workings of a deeply troubled mind. But eventually, after a brief conversation with the murderer, they do get two leads, a receipt and a picture of a woman. So our tension is answered. So about 10 minutes after Mills kicked Doe's door down, we now have a new tension. Will Somerset and Mills be able to use these leads to stop Doe murdering more people? And you can see here that the pace is ramping up. 83 minutes into this film, there has been 3 murders. 93 minutes into this film, there's been 5. And it really is notable just how bad things are getting. You can see when the detectives go to investigate the Lust murder, that they descend several flights of stairs. And the colors are very evocative and overpowering here. They move from a dim blue to a headache yellow and green to an infernal red. They are in hell. And even though there are more murders to come, this one almost feels the most defeating for them, at least of the murders so far. Perhaps because of the cumulative nature of it, perhaps because they had the clues but couldn't get there in time, or perhaps because John Doe is now getting other people to actually do the murdering for him. You'll notice that it's Somerset who is dealing with the man who technically did the killing here. Not to blame the guy or anything, but he has killed someone else in order to save his own life. And Somerset is really beginning to struggle with his need again. And that brings the detectives to a very weary chat in a bar.
I mean, it's easier to lose yourself in drugs than it is to cope with life. It's easier to steal what you want than it is to earn it. Yeah. It's easier to beat a child than it is to raise it. Hell, love costs, takes effort and work.
We are talking about people who are mentally ill. We are talking about people fucking crazies.
No,
Yes.
we're not. No.
Today.
We're talking about everyday life here. You can't afford to be this naive.
In another kind of film, this could be the false resolution. Mills would encourage Somerset. Somerset would get an idea and they'd be rolling. But this is Seven. So the best we've got is that Mills won't accept Somerset's miserablest point of view because he's got Tracy. And as long as he's got Tracy, well, you get the idea. Now, this scene is really important thematically for reasons that, I think will become clear from my discussion later. So I'll wait to talk about that then. But I must note that Somerset goes home, and again, we see that he is alone and truly frustrated now. Meanwhile, Mills goes back home and gets into bed with Tracy, and he really seems to be clinging on for dear life now. But the following morning, there's another murder. This time, Doe has murdered a model for the supposed sin of pride. Now, at the start of Act 2, Somerset walked away from all of this. But here we are at the end of Act 2, and what is Somerset doing? He's requesting to be allowed to stay on. Now, I think it's really important to show that Somerset is taking action here in making this decision to stay on, because what really defines the end of Act 2 is not really caused by either Mills or Somerset. The want for Act 2 was for the detective to catch the murderer, and Seven takes a shocking twist here when John Doe suddenly announces himself to the detectives. With John Doe in custody, we end our Act 2, and we transition with thrilling discomfort into a very mysterious final act. Act 3 is generally made up of two sequences, the false resolution and the true resolution, and oh boy, does Seven have an Act 3. The whole film is so good, but this last 25 minutes is really what makes it a classic. Doe claims there are two more bodies buried somewhere, and he'll take Mills and Somerset there alone. Again, on the protagonist question here, note that Mills decides to do this first, but the final decision, and therefore the scene tension, relies on Somerset. They go because he decides it. And so they're soon in one of the most famous car scenes in cinema history, and there's a lot to discuss here. First of all, the music is incredibly ominous throughout. It's so effective. Secondly, you'll notice here that the camera is doing a lot of visual foreshadowing. There are three people in this car. Two of them are in some way doomed. When we see Somerset, he's traveling from left to right. Our view of him is always unimpeded. Mills and Doe, on the other hand, are moving from right to left. They are also both behind bars often throughout, covered in X's. Somerset is the only one who is free of this game. But most importantly, Somerset is contemplative and selective throughout here. He's letting Doe speak and probing him, and it sets Doe off balance. Mills, on the other hand, can't help but play the game with Doe, and eventually loses his temper because of the prisoner's games. So, character-wise, story-wise, and audio-visual-wise, the film is telling us what is coming. We just don't really know it yet. Also, it should be noted, damn, but these three are good in this scene. I love Pitt's delighted John, after Somerset has pointed out some real food for thought to Doe. Regardless, we're soon exactly where John Doe wants us all to be, and we have our final tension. Will the detectives find out why Doe has brought them to the middle of the desert? And they will, which leads us to one of the most famous endings in modern cinema history. A box gets delivered, and Somerset debates whether to open it. Meanwhile, Doe gets in Mills's ear and reveals what he's done, causing Mills's famous repetitious plea to know just what is in the box. Side note, this is all really grim stuff, but I do find it entertaining that John Doe thinks that his one flaw was being envious of 1995's Brad Pitt. Other than that, just top marks across the board as a human being. Mills, discovering in this moment that he has lost not only his wife, but also an unborn child, cannot take it, and he does what John Doe wants him to. Engulfed in wrath, he shoots an unarmed prisoner. When we next see him, he's clearly a broken man. Exactly 30 minutes ago, he told Somerset that he could not agree that the world is all fucked up. Well, he might think differently now. But the film doesn't finish there. At least this version of the film doesn't. The police chief on site asks Somerset where he'll be, and Somerset responds that he'll be around. It's vague, but it's enough to tell us that he's not leaving. Surrounded almost completely by darkness, Somerset tells us that, despite everything, he will not give up.
Whatever he needs.
Where you gonna be?
Around. I'll be around. Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
Good for you, Somerset. Now I need a drink. I know I always end up saying this, but there really is so much I'd like to talk about with regards to Seven. But the first thing that I think I have to talk about is that first question that I always ask. Whose story is it? Because I think Seven represents an unusually interesting answer here. Normally, I use some basic questions to decide who the protagonist is. The first most basic question is who changes, or maybe who makes the biggest change? And here it's debatable, right? Does Somerset change? I think so for reasons I've outlined above, but it is debatable. Does he change more than Mills? That's certainly very debatable. Then again, how Mills will shake out in the years after this is anyone's guess. Regardless, the second question is whose change defines the film? Now again, this is arguable territory. Mills is the hopeful, ambitious one who shoots an unarmed prisoner, John Doe, at the end. And this is certainly a downer ending, right? So it's Mills's film then, right? I don't think so. Let's consider this idea of the seven sins. Mill's sin is wrath, and we see this throughout. Mills is quick to anger and prone to dismiss people he doesn't like or respect. He gives Somerset shit the moment he sees him. He gets into petty squabbles left and right. So the question is Seven about wrath? Do we feel when we watch Seven that it's asking us some version of, does the world deserve our wrath? Should we be angry with the world? I don't think so. This isn't, Death Wish or Dirty Harry. Seven is much more circumspect than that. So then let's consider what Somerset's sin would be. Well, interestingly, there used to be 8 deadly sins. The 8th deadly sin was acedia. We might call it today apathy or despair. And this, to my mind, is undeniably the central tension or question of Seven. Should we give in to despair? The film really challenges us as it does Somerset. Look at how terrible this place is. Why not just give up? And this tension belongs to Somerset. The question is, will Somerset retire or will Somerset give up? The fact that whether this change will or will not occur is the fundamental tension of Seven, means that Somerset, to my mind, is our protagonist. This is why the coda right at the end is so important. Allegedly, those creatively involved with the film wanted it to end with Mills's gunshots. I wonder if there were other changes made, because this does leave Somerset's arc a little unresolved. It would certainly make the statement that he is powerless in the face of all the evil and cruelty of the world, but he'd be passive in this final moment. Whatever else, this coda not only gives us the faintest glimmer of hope at the end, but it also gives Somerset's arc a conclusion, defined by a decision that Somerset himself makes, which is just good storytelling. And I can't imagine that David Fincher would not be cognizant of that. But there's something else I should note here. There's a reason why there aren't 8 deadly sins. Acedia was decided to be a form of sloth, and so was rolled in as part of that sin. Now, this point might be a bit of a reach, I don't know, but I don't doubt either that Fincher and Walker knew all about this. You'll recall that there are 2 murders in Act 1, there's 2 in Act 3, there's 2 right at the end, of Act 2, so that's 6. And there's one discovered right before Somerset meets Tracy. This is our midpoint, or the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. Somerset's need is to not give in to despair, to acedia. And right at this midpoint, what is the sin that Somerset discovers? Sloth, of which despair is currently considered a part. With this in mind, it certainly colors my understanding of his telling Tracy that with a baby on the way, he gave in to despair, and he thinks it was the right thing for him, and yet he wished he hadn't. At the end of the film, Somerset must want to give in to despair, but this time he won't. Maybe it's the wrong decision, but he won't regret it. So there's one other thing I just want to talk about before I finish here, and that's that question that I started with, what makes Seven so good? And something really stuck with me from my research. My spirit animal, Roger Ebert, said of Seven in a glowing review, it should be noted, Seven is not really a very deep or profound film, but it provides the convincing illusion of one. Now that's an interesting point to make, and almost certainly a debatable one. But I think he's dead on the money when he says, what could be a routine cop movie is elevated by the evocation of dread mythology and symbolism. I think the point that he doesn't get around to, because it's a short review, is just how well Seven uses that myth and symbolism in both its plot and its story. Because, I've watched so many bad horror films that are like, hey, look at this symbolism, and it's terrible. So as I've said already, this question of Somerset's despair, and whether or not that is a sin, is ever present throughout. The sins create a great structure as well for the serial killer plot. But what I found really compelling this last time from analysis is the other symbolism involved in the story of these two cops and the woman in their lives. Again, Somerset's need is to not give in to despair. In other words, to hope. His first unconscious move towards this need is triggered by meeting Tracy. The midpoint, or first conscious move towards his need, is triggered by meeting Tracy. So Tracy, to my mind, represents hope here. And again, I think there's a visual cue with Mills. When we first see them in bed together, Mills is still enthusiastic and ambitious, and she's draped all over him. When he's feeling dejected at the end of Act 2, he climbs into bed with her and clings on for dear life. And then Somerset's big decision at the end is whether or not to open a box that contains hope and out of which only evil comes. It's highly suggestive of the death of hope and a world beset by evil. Now, I think the most important thing to note here is that you never have to think the words Pandora's box to understand Seven or what it means. The story works very much in its own right. But whether or not Seven is actually profound, that kind of mythological and symbolic underpinning of a story's character arc sure provides a compelling illusion. This has been Mark Overanalyses Film on Seven. I've done a few real downers lately, so next time I'll be looking at the endlessly delightful When Nora Ephron Changed Rom-Coms, also known as When Harry Met Sally. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, whatever else it is that's good for this kind of thing. Special thanks to Mary-Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.